Let's talk about 2014. Let's start with the environment part. Scott Fulton, what's going to happen?
Okay, well, good greetings, everyone. Here we go. After having just received my instruction, I probably forgot. Good greetings, Xinyan Kuai Lu. Happy Chinese New Year. A perfect time for us to reflect a bit on where we are and where things are going. For my part, I'll be talking about my former agency, EPA. Since the last time we did one of these, new administrators arrived, Gina McCarthy, the former head of the Air Radiation Program at EPA in the first term, in my view, a wicked smart Bostonian who is hardwired both for action, but I think also for pragmatism, partly because she comes from a bipartisan background prior to her time at EPA. We can talk more in the Q&A perhaps about the supporting cast at EPA, but as I see it, as Gina McCarthy is having the opportunity to fill positions, she seems to be looking for like-minded individuals to support her work there. There's also a very important nomination that's pending at the moment at the Department of Justice. This is someone that I think maybe you know fairly well. And we're all very excited in seeing how that sets up and moves forward. Budget has to be the starting point in talking about EPA. EPA is just coming off its first experience with a sequestered budget, which is basically a 5% across-the-board reduction in fiscal year 2013. 2014 basically carries those reductions forward. It's a flat year in budget terms, with one exception. There's a little bit of a bump up in the Clean Water Act infrastructure funds, but otherwise a flat budget. But 2015 promises to be another year of significant budget impact for EPA. It's projected that the agency will need to take another reduction in the range of $600 to $800 million, which is pushing up towards 10% of its base budget. A lot of cuts have been taken thus far in the so-called extramural resources at EPA, the grants and contracts and those sorts of things. The cuts that are expected for 2015 are likely to register with payroll in a much more significant way than in the past. And EPA is trending from an organization that just a few years ago was 18,000 employees to one that's expected to be 16,000 employees by the end of 2015. An early indication of what that means we saw in the form of a draft strategic plan that EPA put out a couple of months ago. If you haven't looked at it, you should. It projects, among other things, a fairly steep decline in enforcement outputs, significant enforcement outputs, in the range of 30 to 50% for things like inspections and administrative and civil enforcement. This draft strategic plan has drawn a lot of comments. Needless to say, we'll see how it turns out. But my guess is it probably won't turn out as a, oh, never mind. I think there will be impacts in terms of boots on the ground for EPA. And in the category of trying to get the job done with fewer boots on the ground, we should note the emergence of the next generation compliance program or philosophy at the agency, which really is sort of staring down this reality of fewer resources and looking at relying more heavily on such mechanisms as third-party verification or validation as an alternative to inspections, maximizing electronic reporting, and creating and enabling information platforms that allow non-governmental accountability sources like customers, investors, insurers, and the NGO community to play a more important role in holding poor environmental performers accountable. So I think this means more reporting, more public disclosure, even during a period of declining resources. If you want to read a little bit more about this, Cynthia Giles had an article in ELI's Environmental Law Journal a few months back that sketches this in further detail. This also suggests that there's probably room for another discussion about greater reliance by regulators on self-governance by strong environmental performers. If you really want to focus declining resources where they matter most, this probably needs to be part of the discussion. And in that discussion may lie some opportunity to develop some new voluntary programs for industry. Programmatic action, let's take a walk down through the programmatic areas for EPA and talk about what's hot and coming. In the air arena, unquestionably, the primary action item is the new sort of performance standard for fossil fuel-fired power plants under Section 111 of the Clean Air Act. That has two pieces, as many of you know. There's 111B, which is the provision that deals with the new power plant builds. And then there's 111D, which envisions a program that would follow the 111B, a set of expectations for states to develop an existing source program for power plants. Everyone who works in this area knows that the action is really in the 111D bucket. The existing source community, that's partly because there are few, if any, coal-fired power plants that are expected to be built in the near term. So if you're serious about greenhouse gas mitigation, you really have to be looking at the existing source fleet as the primary point of focus. But the progression is 111B and then 111D. The agency came out with a re-proposed 111B rule not too long ago, which has already generated a lawsuit by the state of Nebraska and the introduction of a Congressional Review Act resolution by Senator McConnell to try to hold the agency in place. So if the objective was to kind of get past 111B so that the 111 important work of 111D work can begin, it's not clear that that has been achieved. But this is an area of which EPA will be very much focused. And the schedule for 111D is a very ambitious schedule. There's supposed to be draft guidelines out by June of this year, followed by final guidelines by June of 2015, followed by state submissions of programs. And this operates much the way that state implementation plans do. So the state plans are to be in by June of 2016 with the goal of wrapping this by the end of this administration. Because this is the President's schedule, not EPA's schedule, my guess is that they will meet it. The other thing to watch from a regulatory standpoint, the air program, is ozone. 5-year cycle for ozone review is back upon the agency. Technically, the 5-year period ran in 2013. It looks like EPA will have to do something with ozone and what remains of the Obama administration's watch. This is a difficult piece of work because the science is pushing the standard downward, and a downward moving ozone standard presents non-attainment problems and other issues that are viewed as potentially impeding economic development. So whether it would be an objective of their choosing or not, this is something that will probably have to be addressed in what remains of the administration. Dealing with any fallout or difficulties from the pending court decisions also could be an important point of focus for the agency in the air arena. We have a couple of things pending before the Supreme Court. The greenhouse gas PSD tailoring rule is up for argument before the court on the 24th of this month, I believe. Everybody's watching that with great interest. The cross-state air pollution rule was argued back in December. Also a subject of great interest. We'll see what the court does with that. The MATS rule, mercury air toxic standard, pending before the DC Circuit, and a challenge there, also an important rule to the agency. Waterfront, waters of the United States, and dealing with the question of the reach of the Clean Water Act and what constitutes a jurisdictional water under the Clean Water Act is the primary deliverable of the water program and what remains to the Obama administration. The administration has moved from trying to do this through clarifying guidance to a rulemaking track along with the Corps of Engineers, and is experiencing what the rulemaking track often bears, which is difficulty in the first instance getting the proposal through OMB. Discussions about within the administration apparently on the issue of what kind of nexus should be required in order to have a jurisdictional water. Once it's out of OMB and in the public domain, this will be the subject of a lot of discussion, and will have a horizon that will extend far beyond the Obama administration in terms of completion of the rule, but ultimately the litigation that promises to follow that. On RCRA, the long-awaited coal combustion residue rule is now on a new schedule for delivery and berthing in mid-December of this year, according to a consent decree that the agency just entered into. This is coal ash from power plants and how they can be properly managed, great interest to the power sector. In the chemicals arena, the goal there is TSCA reform, and trying to bring this legislation that's introduced by Senators Lautenberg and Bitter over the goal line. Big issues remain with respect to preemption of state programs. California being one of the principal programs of focus there, and has an uncertain fate at this point. 50-50 maybe. There's a lot of hope that this could be delivered because the country desperately needs an expression of the capacity of the Congress to produce environmental legislation when it's needed. A related bill that's moving forward now is the bill that was just introduced by the senators from West Virginia in response to the Freedom Chemicals bill. We'll see what happens with that. I think some folks are a little worried that it might distract attention away from TSCA reform. We'll see. You know, that some of the country has often been most successful with environmental legislation in response to a disaster. So maybe this is the kind of disaster that will produce that sort of outcome. On the cross-cutting front, sustainability, I would just mention as something that has emerged for the first time as a standalone priority on EPA's list of signature priorities. And this reflects the intention and hope of EPA to take this emerging idea and mainstream it in its programs. I would suggest this is at a fairly nascent stage, and a good deal of thinking needs to be done about how to work with that in the context of these regulatory programs. The final thing I'll mention is kind of a process-related priority. EPA is at this point, I think, looking towards partnership, particularly renewed and reinvigorated partnership with the states and local governments, but also partnership with industry. I think this is in part a reflection of the budget reality within which the agency is working, and the need to find ways of leveraging work beyond the government to get this business of environmental protection done. It's also a reflection of the reality that a lot of the creative thought that's out there on issues like sustainability resides not within government, or at least not in the federal government, but with local government and within industry. So part of this partnership objective is about harnessing the good thinking that's out there and having that inform the thinking of the federal government about what this idea means in this setting. So those are some of the high points. With that, I'll turn it over to Sheila.
Thank you so much, Scott. Pleasure to be with you all today, and thank you for the honor of being on this august panel. It's hard to be amongst the giants of environmental law and be a simple company energy lawyer. Well, to put the perspective that at least I have from my perch in DC, I think that the massive restructure of the energy industry, the makeup of the energy industry in the country, the reliance on various fuels is undergoing probably the biggest change, and reflected in it is energy policy that either helps formulate or follows what's going on in U.S. energy supply and utilization. In 40 years, since the enactment of the Energy Policy Act 1978 and the formation of the Department of Energy, I think we're seeing structural changes that have simply, there may have been run-ups and run-downs, but this is truly a complete reshuffling of the deck that you're seeing occur. We're living it day to day. At the core of concerns is basic reliability of energy supply, electric energy supply, and I'll return to that, and cybersecurity. But what is going on behind the scenes, Scott did a very good presentation on a few moments ago. Obviously, the pressure on continued utilization of coal in the electric generation business, due not only, let me say, to EPA regulations, but also to the age of a number of the plants and the need to retire and replace. And also, understanding that many of the things I'll say will be subject to debate as to whether it's a good idea or a bad idea. I come simply to report on it. Export opportunities for American coal to parts of the world where coal supply is demanded and needed in lieu of other energy supply. That is the reality. The second thing that's going on is sort of along the lines of the coal situation, but with a different backdrop, and that is nuclear plant retirements. Most of the nuclear plants, if not all of the major generating facilities that serve our electric market are approximately 38 to 40 years old. And much like the coal plants, you're seeing them be retired out for a variety of reasons, either lack of support for the retention of the plants in their particular geographic location, concerns post-Fukushima, or basically market dynamics, and this relates to another area that I won't delve into in greater depth, and that is the natural gas revolution. And as you know, if you listen to the State of the Union, you know the president called natural gas the bridge fuel. And I think that is an underlying theme of a lot of things you're seeing happening in a variety of markets now, and the natural gas plants are somewhat easier to build. We'll return to that in greater detail. But with respect to the nuclear reactors, if you have a pie chart, for those of you that haven't seen the magic pie chart of the makeup of the electric generation mix in the country, about 45 to 47% of the mix is still made up of coal-fired generation. Approximately 20% is nuclear. Approximately 27% is made up of natural gas-fired generation, 25 to 27%, and then the rest is renewables, including hydro, either old hydro or smaller new hydro. And I know there's debate as to how pure hydro is, depending on who you speak to, but it is in fact renewable, whether it is depending on whether you like it or not. Returning to the overall pie chart issues, there are new nuclear plants coming online, several in the south, huge plants that have been rolled out over the past 10 years, but by and large there's fewer coming on than there are that are rolling off with respect to either just opting out because of market conditions, age, or other factors, just decline in demand in some areas. Now we come on, and let me say also another issue which with respect to nuclear that I need to mention is, of course, the waste storage, and that whole issue is just out there as a looming issue that is completely unresolved with respect to nuclear waste, as to whether it stays where it is. The Yucca Mountain saga, I would call it a disaster, a train wreck that's gone on for 25 or 30 years, has gone nowhere past after the expenditure of many millions of dollars. completely unresolved presidential commission on it. Right now, all of the nuclear waste in the country fundamentally is being stored in pools or in dry cask storage at all existing nuclear plants around the country. And what to do with it? Well, there's a plan, but it's a very, even the short term is a long-term plan to deal with nuclear waste. So that's a whole other looming issue that we have to contend with. Also, there are a number of proposals for something called SMRs. You see this terminology, SMRs, small modular reactors, small nuclear reactors that are, their proponents say they're easier to site, easier to develop, that you can package them like 6-pack of small modular reactors to create the equivalent of one big nuclear reactor. They believe that there's much less waste produced and other benefits to it. But now let's move on to where the action is on such a massive scale. Across the country, there's probably 34, 35 states which this impacts. It's not only a domestic opportunity, but it is a showing up in other parts of the world as an opportunity, and that is the natural gas that is being produced by hydraulic fracturing. It has remarkably large potential. 8 years ago, there were very few proponents, although there was the technology there. It's been expanded, enhanced, and further developed. But this is what's really changing the fundamentals of the marketplace, the availability of cheaper natural gas, the ability to build natural gas-fired generation, which is about 100 times easier to site than a nuclear plant, for example, and the near impossibility of siting a new coal plant. But the production of energy from a facility like that is quite significant. So, of course, all the pie charts for the future show the expansion of natural gas-fired generation vis-a-vis what the president described as the bridge fuel. Obviously, there's debate over that. Oh, I really better go a long shot here. I'm sorry, I'm just getting warmed up here. All right. Also, let me say that additional oil reserves are being produced as a result of the technology that's being developed. Now, let me return just to for a moment to the polar vortex, which you may think is a little off topic, but the coordination, particularly in the Northeast, between gas and electric, the need for coordination between those two markets, the supply of natural gas to all these new natural gas generating facilities, and the old ones too, is very dependent on the availability of gas. So you have to build pipelines to get the gas there, or you have to import LNG, but that's done. You don't need to import it because you have it domestically. But what's going on is very interesting. New infrastructure for natural gas pipelines to support the electric generation will have to take place. Reconfiguration of existing pipeline structure, because the pipelines are now flowing in the wrong directions compared to where the reserves are. So you're going to see a massive amount of new pipeline construction, or reconfiguration, or repurposing of existing pipelines that are natural gas pipelines but no longer are necessary in that particular market, turned into oil pipelines or into products pipelines. Export, 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 export oil, export gas. That is the central political issue at DOE right now, I believe, and it is highly politicized, very driven by the desire, obviously, of American producers to be able to export. On the other side of the equation, some manufacturers, not all, there's a very great divide, want to retain the natural gas in the U.S. for a variety of reasons, but particularly the price of gas going forward and the availability for electric generation and for manufacturing. But on the other side of the equation, there's more gas than probably can be used, at least in the midterm, if not the long term. So this is up before DOE. They're stacked up like planes waiting to land at JFK after a holiday weekend. They're trying to get these up and out of DOE. This is probably the hottest political issue I think buzzing along in DOE right now. Another factor, quickly, is decline in demand for electric energy as a result of all the efficiency gains we've got. Very interesting. Building design, appliance design, all the efficiency standards that we've been busily working away on, like little gerbils on wheel for a long time, in addition to them and expansion of them, they're moving along. There is truly an impact of that, plus general more awareness of the need to conserve energy at all levels, and conservation in general, just more awareness of it. But basic fundamental building design, community design, lifestyle changes, smaller cars, the whole package is reducing demand for energy. That's an issue for the utilities, which I think Glassville, Southville, Broward, but I'll spare you the more details. The renewables development obviously has been supported through tax credits and the like, and I think that's going to go on in one form or another for a very long time. I think the exciting parade of goodies that have been dropped off in various spots over the past few years may slow down, but the need for renewables is still out there. The question is certainly with respect to electric energy, the utilization of renewables, fitting in with the reliability of the grid, redesigning the grid, adding enhancements to the grid to make the grid more adaptable and able to accept, and also the utilities able to accept the renewable energy and still provide the power that's necessary to power an economy that's utterly, completely, and totally dependent on energy supply that is reliable and also cost effective. Another factor I'm going to hit on very quickly, that's the water-energy nexus, a huge issue, which I would be delighted to talk to you about in greater detail, but obviously there's a lot of water that's used in the hydraulic fracturing process, there's a lot of water that's used in the electric generation place, arena, including with respect to the cooling water issue with nuclear plants. That's another factor that may lead to the more rapid retirement of nuclear plants need to comply with that requirement, as well as coal. Understanding the nuclear plants by and large are built either on a river, a lake, or an ocean. And the impacts on those bodies of water, small or large, are going to be subject to these cooling tower requirements. Okay, moving on. The infrastructure I mentioned to you, transmission lines necessary to carry the renewables. I mentioned to you the need to update the grid and to basically technologically improve the grid as well as just plain old replacing this old infrastructure. And this whole infrastructure issue is the subject to a quadrennial review, which has just been announced by DOE in the past couple of weeks. You're going to see a lot of action on that. It's all centered around the question of infrastructure. All right, cyber and related infrastructure issues. Cybersecurity in the energy arena is huge. There have been incursions every day. There's thousands of attempted incursions into our grids, into our electric utilities, into our nuclear plants. This is a huge issue, and the impact of that could be so enormous, it's astonishing. Think back to the blackout of 2003. That'll give you a sample of what this could mean. Due to the level of sophistication that's developed in the cyber incursion area, it's very, very frightening. And the grid is the first place that they're focused on these incursions. One final thing, let me mention enforcement in energy with respect to market manipulation. There is a huge enforcement effort that the FERC and the CFTC, those two agencies are still trying to really work out their love affair, which has been an ongoing saga over a number of years, but they're working on it. They're making progress. They've had a new agreement between them. But there's been hundreds of millions of dollars collected in enforcement penalties. There's been disgorgements. There's been fines. And there's also been some appetite for going after individuals in a major way. This is something really to watch. It flies beneath the radar pretty much in the popular press. It just doesn't catch the eye, but it's a terribly important area. And the nominee for the firm chairmanship, which is being held right now on an interim basis by Cheryl LaFleur, is Norman Bay. He is the head of the enforcement office at FERC right now, a former U.S. attorney from New Mexico. And his focus has been for the last 3 or 4 years is enforcement. I think if he becomes chairman, there's a substantial chance that it will intensify the enforcement efforts directly and indirectly. All right, I will wrap up by saying we're in the center of a really truly transformational phase in the history of energy law and policy, and I think we're just really at the beginning of what we'll have to do over the next decade.
Bill Meadows.
Sheila, thank you. Scott, thank you. I'm looking forward to Gary and John. Thank you for the introductions. We'll change direction a bit, and then talk about land conservation. Let me start by saying a word about the Environmental Law Institute and why I am here. I'm on the board, and I joined the board because I saw the Environmental Law Institute as a place where many stakeholders come together to deal with really almost intractable issues. And it's an organization that truly focuses on solutions. And I think within this room and on the phone, there are people with a lot of different perspectives on, let's say, land conservation and how we might proceed in 2014. It's not an area that is without conflict. And I'm going to speak to that a little bit. But I think the Environmental Law Institute is a place that brings stakeholders together to really deal with issues effectively and try to reach workable solutions. And so I want to posit the idea that 2014 may in fact be a year in which we can focus on solutions. That's made possible in large measure because of all of the barriers that we already know about, whether it's through Congress or whether it's through this increased energy development. There are lots of opportunities, I think, to resolve some environmental issues and look at better conservation. And I think everyone here has a chance to help in that process, and so that's the case I would make. I think the two best examples of where solutions lie. One is in what I describe as the nexus of energy development, conservation, and mitigation on all land, but particularly in public lands, which is the area which I work most of my career. The second has to do with the use of administrative authorities to gain land protection. And I'll speak about both of those because I think that's where great opportunity lies. The opportunities around the land protection really come from the fact that our Congress will do nothing. It's in gridlock. It is ironic that here we are in a year in which we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Wilderness Act, arguably the most important single land conservation measure ever. And we were almost certainly going to end this year having to report 2 consecutive Congresses with no wilderness designation. Never been the case before the last Congress. And it's going to repeat itself this year, almost certainly. So it's ironic. So what does one do when the congressional authorities are not being exercised, where there's not a place where you really can go to deal with those critical issues? I think the second opportunity comes from, it's really, to me, it is a response to this expanded energy development on American lands. Natural gas in particular, but certainly oil coming from shale development is another. There's a lot of conflict that occurs, whether it's around water or wildlife or conservation interests. And the president continues to speak about an all-of-the-above energy strategy, which sends shivers up and down the backs of environmental activists. And so how do you deal with that? And I think there is an opportunity, there's a lot of authority given through the planning processes to be able to deal with those issues pretty effectively and come out with some very serious, significant conservation plans. I see a path forward, and I see it being laid out, first of all, by a really remarkable speech that Secretary Jewell made at the Press Club back in November 3rd, where she talked about what the priorities for the Department of the Interior would be for her tenure, and certainly for this year. And she spoke about getting kids out of doors and get them engaged in the outdoors and try to find ways in which to put them to work in national parks and working on trails and a variety of different aspects. And all of that's wonderful. I think they're all building the next constituency for public land interest and conservation leadership coming out of that new generation engagement. I think the second part is just experiencing America's great outdoors. in the first term, one of the major emphases with Ken Salazar and President Obama was development of what was known as America's Great Outdoors. It's a pretty loose array of programmatic opportunities, not necessarily goals. It gave a lot of space for people to do a lot of things around creating refuges, looking at urban parks, looking at ways in which you build large landscape conservation opportunities, but not any requirements. It was considered by most of the environmental community to be a pretty soft effort, although I saw it as a really good way to frame all the opportunities that we have in the conservation world. What I want to speak to are the two things that she did talk about that have substantive outcomes in conservation in this speech. The first was the willingness to utilize the Antiquities Act for land protection when Congress would allow it. So this follows directly on what I see as the opening coming from the President's State of the Union address. And so much of the press following that has been recognition that there's not going to be much action in Congress. So therefore, whatever the arena is, whether it's in carbon, or whether it is in water, or whether it is in land, whether it is in healthcare, the administration has the authority to do a lot. And Sally Jewell spoke to the ways in which those authorities could be used in land conservation. I'm going to speak a bit more about that. The second piece that she spoke about was mitigation. When there is energy development on public land, there's a cost. There is a conservation loss or degradation part. So how do you mitigate that? And there's an entire process underway right now task force inside Interior working on sort of secretarial order and how that's implemented. But there's a real opportunity I see in the next year to really give shape to the mitigation of degradation in land caused by or comes from energy development. This is a place where the nexus of energy conservation and mitigation is a place where there are many stakeholders have already come together. Recreational interests, sportsmen, the advocacy organization. There are actually a number of people in the industry who have indicated an interest in being part of that conversation because it offers perhaps a way to avoid some litigation and actually to get faster permitting on places. So our ability to be able to bring a community together to help shape what that conservation and mitigation strategy might be is really important and I think can be done this year. If you look at the work that's already been done inside the Department of Interior, particularly in the Bureau of Land Management, they are set to act on that kind of implementation. So the idea, and it's already been described, I think, in the past by the work that was done in the California desert, creating zones for development of solar plants, and that's been transferred to really the way in which we think about development of solar facilities in the American Southwest. The same thing happened inside the Department of Interior, looking at the way in which decisions were made about energy development in the National Petroleum Reserve, which is the western part of the Arctic slope of Alaska. And essentially, half of the reserve of 23 million acres was open for development, and the other half was set aside for conservation or for withdrawing from energy development because of caribou, waterfowl, a variety of wildlife species. The end result was positive. You ended up with a support for energy development, and at the same time, a recognition that there are conservation values that need to be protected. And that's the outcome that so many of us are interested in, and that I see as possible in this year because of the secretarial order, because of the way in which the environmental community thinks about all of the above energy development. All of the above energy development, that theme for the president is a reality. We've just heard, the variety of supply opportunities that we have. But how do you deal with that in a way that also protects the conservation values? And in every place we work, there's wildlife, water, recreational interest, and people who are engaged in that work are eager to find a way to see that energy development occurs in the right places, the right spacing, the right way. But at the same time, there's opportunity to do conservation mitigation. The last thing I'd like to say about these issues is that Secretary Jewell just returned from a trip a week ago in which she hit 3 spots that represent, I think, the great opportunities and also challenges for the Department of Interior and for the Administration of Conservation. The first stop was in Craig, Colorado, northwest Colorado, and she was a place that's the center of energy development, but it's also a spot center for sage-grouse population. So this intersection between sage-grouse and energy, the Endangered Species Act being constantly challenged inside Congress. Seems like this week every piece of legislation had some comment about how do we weaken NEPA, how do we weaken the Endangered Species Act. She brought stakeholders together in Craig, Colorado, which is a tough place, to talk about that opportunity, the opportunity that comes from how do you protect sage-grouse. By the way, Fish and Wildlife Service is under court order to have planned by the end of 2015. So, this is not something that's going to slip very easily. And it offers the kind of, let's say, go and perhaps a little bit of a hammer for all the industry and conservation to come together and see how do you figure out how to manage sage-grouse in this environment. The second stop was in Salt Lake City, the Outdoor Industry Association's annual Recreation Expo. That setting, she brought together energy companies who are working on oil and gas leasing on federal lands. So all the state and environmental leaders and folk from agencies and state leaders together to talk about master leasing plans. It's this context, a master leasing plan, in which you can make decisions about where you're going to develop in this ecosystem, where you're not, and making certain that everyone comes to at least a consideration of what the right outcome is. It's a challenge, but it's going to happen. It's a place where BLM is investing all of its energy, a lot of its energy right now. And the response, she had a great session, and the response was really quite positive. Her last stop was in Las Cruces, New Mexico. She accompanied Senators Heinrich and Udall. There is a proposal to designate as a national monument, legislatively, 500,000 acres of a place called Organ Mountains, really spectacular place. That's not going to pass Congress. And if it doesn't pass Congress, Secretary Jewell stated, we'll recommend to the President that we protect this by use of the Antiquities Act. So this is, because of congressional inaction, there's an opportunity, I think, to identify special places. Make the case. You're not going to do anything with this administration, I don't think, very cautious group of people, without having already built local support for these special places and for these special processes. If you bring the right stakeholders together, there's an opportunity, I think, in 2014 to reach a lot of positive outcomes in conservation. Gary?
Well, thank you all. Thanks to ELI for hosting and to our hosts here. And it's a privilege to be with this extraordinary group of panelists. I think it's tempting to perhaps say that the decisive event in environmental and energy law will be the Senate Judiciary's consideration and then the full Senate's consideration of John's nomination as Assistant Attorney General. But I think it is right to pause for a second and thank him for his willingness to serve and to really contribute to our country's dialogue around these issues. And I know we're all very appreciative of that. But there are a few other things that are likely to happen over the next year for certain. I agree with Sheila's observation very much that this has all the makings of being an extraordinary year. All the makings of a year of extraordinary focus and intensity around this set of issues. And to understand that, I think it's actually helpful to start by looking back instead of looking forward. Let me just do that for a second and quote something that the President said. And the way he framed this set of issues as early as a few months after he first took office in his first Earth Day speech. He went to renewable energy manufacturer in Iowa, and he said, now, the choice we face is not between saving our environment and saving our economy. The choice we face is between prosperity and decline. We can remain the world's leading importer of oil, or we can become the world's leading exporter of clean energy. We can allow climate change to wreak unnatural havoc across the landscape, or we can create jobs working to prevent its worst effects. We can hand over the jobs of the 21st century to our competitors, or we can confront what countries in Europe and Asia have already recognized as both a challenge and an opportunity. The nation that leads the world in creating new energy sources will be the nation that leads the 21st century global economy. He said America can be that nation, America must be that nation. And I think what's striking about that quote is really three things. One is the recognition that environmental issues and energy issues in many ways are flip sides of the same coin, that they're integrally related. Secondly, that the choice between the environment and the economy from the start isn't one that the president recognized as valid. In fact, he went the other direction and recognized that we need to address these issues in order to have a sustainable economic recovery, and he's echoed those themes recently. And then lastly, the centrality of these issues, the consistency and the continuing nature of them. And I think if you look at the things that have set the agenda for this coming year, the president's second term inauguration speech, where he elevated this set of issues, not just to a set of economic issues, but to a moral imperative in some ways, talking about how he looks his children in the eye every day and thinks about what the future might look like. And then to his first State of the Union in his second term, where he laid out an ambitious agenda around these issues, and then to just the other evening, where he again emphasized that with a whole range of things going on in the country, environmental and energy issues, addressing climate change, continue to be an absolutely central part of a fairly, a smaller agenda going forward, but nonetheless a very elevated perspective on these issues. And in this area, there really is an ambitious agenda. It was largely set out on the administration's part, very much in the climate action plan that the president announced in June. And that was, I think, the first time when the president wove together the things that are happening around domestic emissions reductions for carbon pollution, for greenhouse gases, the approach on international issues, and those things that are necessary for enhancing the country's preparedness and resilience around climate change into a consistent narrative, so people could begin to understand what it is the administration was pledging to do, when it was planning on doing it, how it was going to do it, what authorities it was going to deploy, and why it was going about doing all those things. And I think what perhaps is different now, and perhaps what is different going forward over the next year and the next 2 and 3 years, is that not just that there's this agenda that's been laid out, but that there's the ticking of the clock. And that the president and his administration have firmly heard the ticking of the clock, and that everyone else hears it as well. So there's in many ways, I think, a really interesting dynamic going on between the administration looking to aggressively move forward with that very clearly laid out agenda, to questions about what the courts may do with this agenda and how active they ultimately may choose to be, and to how Congress ultimately affects that agenda, and then where a variety of players in the NGO world and in the private sector are on how that agenda ultimately gets implemented. The The signature piece of that agenda, Scott referred to it, in many ways, is the effort to address carbon pollution from fossil-fired power plants, beginning with the Clean Air Act Section 111B, new source power plant effort, which EPA re-proposed, and then leading to the proposal for existing source regulation under Section 111D. And as part of that climate action plan, the President laid out a very clear set of timeframes. And that really reflects the end of the administration working backwards, a recognition that states under a SIP-like program will be making many of the decisions, and there needs to be time for the administration both to put out guidelines, to have the states have their fair take at the opportunity around making choices under those guidelines, and then to ensure that during this administration there still is an opportunity to look at those state choices and assess their adequacy and take action in the event the administration determines that they're in some measure deficient. So this time frame, this critical period when there is a look at the best system of emissions reduction and how carbon capture and storage for new sources fits into that definition, to flexibilities and a very robust public dialogue around flexibilities under the existing source provisions, how those admit of new technology, how those admit of energy efficiency, how those admit of fleet-based approaches, and how that then affects the stringency of those standards will be a really robust and really interesting debate. And add to that some, very almost novel efforts to, for example, have a lawsuit around a proposed action that some private litigants are bringing or states are bringing, congressional oversight, and the potential, for example, the legislation that looks at a Congressional Review Act action for proposed rulemaking. Interesting concept and idea. But obviously, the administration's ability to move forward with these things will depend upon a series of external events that may or may not serve to derail these efforts. Nonetheless, it is clear from the State of the Union that the administration's committed to unilateral action where it can't get congressional agreement, and working with Congress where it can. Now, I think it's at least worth pausing for a second to recognize that unilateral action can be of a few different kinds. It can be coming up with a plan, for example, on how to effectively green the federal government and promote renewables in federal government operations and address climate change and prepare the federal government to be as resilient as possible, to reach out to state and local and tribal leaders and set up task forces to develop plans and promote that, where it can be actually just moving forward in a public notice and comment process with already existing authority under already existing legislation. And it's worth recognizing that there are a variety of tools that, in fact, the executive branch has by which to move forward, some of which are in some ways more inherently unilateral than others, which are really about moving forward with existing congressional authorizations. I think there are some real questions that remain to be seen about how activist the courts will be. Cross-state air pollution rule in the Supreme Court, which, although not a climate-related case, nonetheless could fundamentally affect the kinds of technologies that facilities will be required to put on to address the long-range transport of pollutants, primarily from the south and Midwest to the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast, and the rationality of the EPA plan, a highly technical plan to do that. How activist will the Supreme Court be around that issue? That can affect the choices that utilities have to make about whether to change from a coal-fired power plant to a natural gas fleet. So it could be a very important case in this arena. The argument that's coming up on the 24th of this month, where although the court took a very limited slice of the petitions that were presented to it, and is only looking at that question around the permissibility of addressing through the so-called PSD program based upon motor vehicle emissions regulation, stationary sources, and carbon pollution from those stationary sources. The court declined to look at the fundamental underlying authority questions of the Clean Air Act, to revisit its Massachusetts versus EPA decision, to revisit the endangerment finding that EPA had made that was a predicate to all of those. Nonetheless, if you read the briefs of the litigants, many of the briefs are really an exercise in trying to either expand the scope of the question presented or to narrow the scope of the question presented. And I think the interesting thing to watch in that arena will be how expansive the court ultimately chooses to be and how deferential they ultimately choose to be to EPA. Likewise, the highly technical issues at the DC Circuit around the Mercury and Act case similarly, I think, lend themselves to some very similar questions. A whole other set of issues that EPA will be moving forward with that complement that agenda, everything from heavy-duty truck regulation of fuel efficiency, continuing work, obviously, within the administration, where there are questions about how large a distraction it becomes on the news from, I guess, the end of last week on the Keystone Pipeline environmental review. Will be really sort of interesting to see whether that becomes, again, a issue that Congress takes up, and things like the debt ceiling, as there have been some discussions around, or whether the administration can continue that review in an orderly fashion. And I think that really goes to the administration's ability to keep, in some ways, the rest of the agenda intact, or how large a distraction other issues ultimately become. Important work to be done under the National Environmental Policy Act, the original environmental statute in many ways, on how to think about greenhouse gas emissions. The Council on Environmental Quality has draft proposed guidance around that and has been working on those issues. That has all sorts of implications for all sorts of other issues, including how to think about large projects that, for example, some of the coal export issues, what's the right analytical framework for considering greenhouse gas emissions in thinking about those projects where there is federal action that affects the environment. And then how the NEPA world relates to this effort to enhance infrastructure, and what are the kinds of efficiencies that can exist, whether that be for renewables, for transmission, for natural gas manufacturing that the President referred to in the State of the Union. Some real opportunities there. Some of that will be previewed in Congress in particular proposals. As Bill mentioned, some of it will be reflected in the transportation reauthorization debate in Congress, where there's some thinking about how to achieve efficiencies in that system, but maintain the integrity of public participation and environmental review. So really important efforts there. Obviously, a number of other critical rulemakings that are moving forward in some fashion or another. Ozone, the National Ambient Air Quality Standards Consideration, waters in the U.S., affecting the jurisdiction of the exercise of Clean Water Act authority, and then some really interesting questions on whether or not there can be agreement in Congress on some critical reforms, and that includes continuing support for renewables in things like production tax credits. It includes some novel financing tools like master limited partnerships and whether those become available to renewables. It includes the discussion that there has been around a variety of energy efficiency legislative efforts, including state renewable portfolio or electricity portfolio standards, and whether those become in some way brought across the line to a federal level, and this question about reform of the Toxic Substances Control Act, TSCA, and recognition that the status quo perhaps isn't working well from either the public perspective, the agency perspective, the industry perspective, or the environmental advocacy group perspective, so that there may be an alignment of incentives to try and find common ground and achieve a fix. But whether or not there will be a recognition that a bipartisan environmental accomplishment is something that's needed or just too difficult to do in the current environment is something that obviously will be really interesting to watch and remains to be seen. So I know we look forward to questions, and the panel looks forward to a great discussion on that position.
For all our panelists, that's wonderful. It's administrative, executive, courts, states, federal government, international issues. This is why the environment, energy, and natural resource area is so exciting, is that juxtaposition of policy, law, economics, science, environment into this area that we call our practice. So tell your friends and neighbors you're proud of what you do. To all law students, this is a great growth area. You can find jobs. And now let's turn to our panelists. And Sheila, I want to ask you, people matter. You've got a new Secretary of Energy. At least, you know, it looks like the president has nominated a new ambassador for China, Max Baucus, which means that the job in finance is open. Maybe Senator Ron Wyden moves over from finance and opens up the Energy Committee. What does that mean for DOE? What does that do? Does Mary Landrieu become the new energy chair for the committee? What happens?
Yeah, it appears that Senator Landrieu would move into that slot, and it's certainly a slot that she is, I think, enthusiastic about taking. And she brings a different perspective than Senator Wyden, certainly. A very different perspective, because after all, Louisiana is one of the big producing states from an oil and gas perspective in the country, as many of the refineries, gas pipelines. Pipeline Alley goes right straight through Louisiana, and is very expert in those areas. So it will change the dynamics. It could change the dynamics on the committee. Depends on who else is on the committee, of course, and how the shuffle occurs. But certainly will be, I think, a different perspective. Solely, I think, if nothing else, just reflective of the two states from which the senators come from and their backdrop.
One more people issue. Gary, you just came out of the White House. CQ. Looks like John Podesta came in, you left. Maybe he was your replacement, I don't know. But who's replacing Heather Zeigel, and who's going to be taking over CQ?
I think we'll have to obviously wait to see who the president selects for the CEQ position. For the climate and energy position, Van Utek, who's been a long-time deputy and had before that been at the Department of Energy and on Capitol Hill in a variety of positions doing climate, energy, and environmental work, has moved into that role and is hugely capable around these issues. I think that the arrival of John Podesta is really important to these issues. And it really signifies the focus that the administration brings to them and the recognition that they will be a central part of the agenda. During the Clinton administration, John was, as chief of staff, was really instrumental in bringing a number of critical things over the line at the end of the administration. Arsenic in drinking water regulation, launching mercury in power plants, the very ambitious roadless rule that the Clinton administration did. He then went on to form a very effective progressive think tank that has had a very significant role in setting the agenda around renewables and climate. He's been attuned to these issues for a long time, and he really highlighted, I think early in the administration's first term, that it was important not just to think about the box that Congress creates for the administration, but all of the tools that the president has and that executive branch agencies have, and to think about reconnecting directly with the American people around the agenda that the president was elected for. So I think is right as you think about the next year to really acknowledge the very important and central role that he can play and is really likely to play.
I'm transitioning to the questions that I now have. I have a number of questions from our computer listening audience. I'm going to take some of them. I'll open them up right after that to those of you who are listening to us right now. For those of you who gave your questions, I apologize that I'm going to narrow them down a bit so we can get through as many as possible. Bill Meadows, Scott Fulton talked about the budget impact for EPA. What do you see budget issues for the Department of Interior going forward?
Well, it's not been a pretty picture, as everybody knows. I think, though, there is a better face on the budget today than there was 3 months ago. Had the worst-case scenario played out in the conservation arenas with sequestration, you would have seen budget total in about $27 billion. As it turns out, there's about a little north of $30 billion available. So you've got a 10% swing there, which is positive. It's still below the good times, if there ever were any. And I think all of the agencies are stretched and stressed to do their work. And I think some of the opportunities that we laid out are going to be negatively affected by the lack of resources to do those.
Scott Fulton, I have two questions which I'm going to combine, both of them on self-enforcement, self-reporting. One of them asked the question whether or not that really works. Does self-enforcement or self-reporting really work? And then the second is a subset, and that is EPA appears to be honoring its self-policing, self-detection, self-reporting audit policy less frequently. Could be budget or other constraints, but what do you see for the audit policy in 2014?
Okay, good questions. I'll take them in reverse order if that's okay. Where EPA is on the audit policy is partly a reflection of the budget reality that the agency faces. And just to remind people how that works, if a company has a self-monitoring, self-analysis program and identifies an infraction or a problem and brings that to EPA's attention, then it's available to it will be some relaxed outcomes in terms of enforcement response. What the enforcement program has been saying is, look, these audits are undertaken by good environmental performers who generally are not in the prioritization of the agency's work, and when these audit disclosures are brought forward, it requires the agency to put down its other work, looking at poor performers, and focus its resources instead on more positive performers. And in these lean budget times, maybe that is not a role that the enforcement program can continue to play. I think there needs to be further discussion and dialogue about exactly what that means. My own view is it should be possible to preserve the values of the audit policy, which I think over time has actually been quite positive in terms of its accomplishments. But nonetheless appreciates the difficulties from a resourcing standpoint that the agency has. So there have been rumors of the audit policy's outright demise. That's not yet happened. My hope is that EPA will respond to the many voices that are encouraging it to think creatively about how to preserve this policy rather than put it on the shelf. Now, on the question of whether self-monitoring, self-reporting works, I think the answer is yes, provided that the program that is constructed around these ideas itself has integrity, and there are certain things that have to be present in order to ensure that integrity. And one is, at the end of the day, there needs to be some sort of a verification requirement or impetus. And in the environmental programs, that impetus is primarily provided by the strong criminal penalties that attach to false or fraudulent disclosures. If you have those authorities in place and there at least is some enforcement presence that projects to the regulated community that if you cheat, either in what you're monitoring or in what you're reporting, there are consequences that are sufficiently unpleasant to make you want to comply in the first instance. There's no reason these programs can't work. And in fact, when you look back over time at where these ideas have been uptaken most significantly in EPA's regulatory programs, you see some pretty significant success stories. Discharge monitoring reports on the NPDES program, which the courts have viewed as unimpeachable admissions against interest, which have been periodically the subject of follow-up enforcement, surveillance and action to make sure people are filling those things out correctly and properly and being punished criminally if they're not. I think that's produced a program that has some integrity and stands as an important illustration of what can be done as an alternative to having an inspector go out to every facility and engage in monitoring him or herself instead. So I think they can.
All right, so I have additional questions. Right now, awaiting things like XL pipeline, hydraulic fracturing, and U.S. trade issues. But before I turn to any of them, I'm going to go out to our in-person audience and see whether or not we have questions there. Remember, I'd like you to identify yourself and then ask your question. Please, go ahead.
Good morning. I'm Carla. I'm an environmental attorney from Mexico, working regionally, also here in Washington. Sheila, I wanted to ask you mentioned the use of water for cooling the power plants, and the amount of water used for nuclear power plants, but also the combined cycle plants that are natural gas powered. There's also a lot of water use. Do you see any possibility for an air cooling, a mandatory air cooling requirement for new natural gas plants? And additionally, do you see any possibility of feed-in tariff legislation requirements or policy or policy coming from a national level, or do you see the push coming from the states for that to happen?
Sheila, would you repeat, just summarize quickly the question so that those people listening to us can know?
Certainly. Two questions. One, and first of all, the ladies from Mexico, congratulations on opening up the Mexican energy market a little bit. That should make things more exciting, I think, for Mexico to discover and exploit some of the resources it's been holding back on for a long time, make available for the Mexican people. Second, you would ask with respect to the cooling through cooling required possibly for new natural gas fired plants. I think it all depends. Basically, if you're looking to natural gas to be the bridge fuel and you're trying to accelerate the closure of coal plants, to be blunt, trying to accelerate the closure of nuclear plants, there may be some, and I can't really speak directly to it because I really don't know what might be put in place. I know there's enormous sensitivity, obviously, with the drought in California. It's highlighted in a very dramatic way some of the water energy nexus issues that I mentioned in my very rapid presentation. I can't honestly say that I know that would go in place. It may go in place ultimately, but it may be an interim measure that does not go in place immediately because of the desperate need for reliable power on the grid. And then your next question was? The feed-in tariff. Oh, the feed-in tariff. Feed-in tariff, all right, this whole question of feed-in tariff, very interesting. I think it's probably gonna be at the state level, but it's complicated because as a result of the way that the grid operates and the fact that just states can't just wander off and do their own thing because you need to pull power off the grid that moves around, either it gets produced in that state, moves out, or produced outside the state, moves in. The feed-in tariff is a pretty complicated issue. And also, if you look at what's going on in the European Union just in the past week, the debate over the whole question of renewables, the role that renewables play vis-a-vis competitiveness of the EU and various countries in the EU. I think the feed-in tariff issue is certainly one that is not going to go away. It's going to be considered, it may be, and I think it was alluded to by Gary, whether that would be, maybe Scott, with respect to become a national policy, something a la a renewables mandate, and with that perhaps some sort of feed-in tariff. But I don't see it happening right now because the competitive issue, this issue, the jobs issue, to be one. I think this is a package of issues that it's a very delicate balance. If you look at where the new jobs are coming from, frankly, a lot of them are coming from the energy business. And they're not all renewable, all right? Some of them are, but a lot of them aren't. So this whole package of issues, this whole ball of concerns, leads me at least for now to say that the feed-in tariff might be long-term, but not short-term.
So for all the questions who are asking the panel to predict what the Supreme Court will do with greenhouse gas or predict what the President will do with XL Pipeline, we'll skip those questions. But I will ask a subset, and maybe Gary, you're the best person to do it, and that is for XL Pipeline, not what will happen, but what happens now? What's the process that unfolds on XL Pipeline, and who ultimately makes the decision?
Very good question, John. I mean, the environmental review, which has been taking place, has been just that. It's one piece of a broader process, and it will kick off now under an executive order that moves presidential authority for making foreign policy-based decisions on cross-border infrastructure interconnections. It moves that to a orderly process at the State Department. And the test there is what's called a national interest determination. So what the State Department had done was to essentially say, we want to get through the environmental review before we move then to the next step of considering whether or not this application is in the national interest. And there are a few things that are going to happen. One is there will be a public comment process, a 30-day public comment process that I think kicks off today around the environmental review and that national interest determination question. The State Department will make some assessment of its views on national interest determination. Other agencies have a formal opportunity to weigh in and express their views about how that balancing should occur. And then there will be a decision. There's the two, I think, unknowns are what's the timing of that decision, because sort of the minimum times are specified, but there's no maximum or enforceable times that are specified under the executive order. And then secondly, who will make that decision? Whether it will reside and stay with the Secretary of State, or whether the issue has just achieved a level of prominence and interest on that the President will ultimately choose to make that decision. And there have been some indications that suggest that public indications, nothing from my private past, but public statements over the weekend from the President's Chief of Staff and others suggesting that ultimately the decision may not stay with the Secretary of State, but may be made by the President himself. But obviously a lot of interest in this one.
A lot of interest. This is a fun question. This is like your Queen for a Day question to Bill Meadows. Bill, you spoke about using the Antiquities Act to conserve land. If you were Secretary of the Interior, what land would you protect? And the trail question is, What's the role of local citizens in that decision?
Well, I think those are two different approaches, and you would hope they would coincide. I think there's a real interest in the land conservation community in having some integrity in the choices of places to protect. And perhaps that is managing for climate adaptation. Perhaps it's managing for wildlife migration corridors. Perhaps it's managing for cultural resources. But there are a whole array of sort of goals that you would try to achieve in those choices. None of those are going to happen without local support. And when I talked earlier about opportunity, it is this opportunity to identify places that have local interests. These are local business and local political interests. It's not just bringing all the conservations together. It's really broadening that network of interested people. And the reason the Oregon Mountains in New Mexico is such a high priority now is because it has an interest at the local county commission. It has a lot of business support. There's a lot of recreational interest, and there's a lot of ecotourism opportunity. And it's those opportunities, I think, that will emerge. And you will see Secretary Jewell out talking to people about the places they care about. And when you see her somewhere, you can bet that that is a place that is on the radar for the president. And by the way, there's an enormous support in the sportsman's community, the recreation community, and the advocacy community for this. And so it's not an accident that when she goes to Oregon Mountain, there are 400 people who show up and cheer. There's a lot of eager activists trying to build support for this. And to thank her and thank the president when they act.
Last question we can take, and that I'll let Scott lead. Lots of discussions of hydraulic fracturing, lots of talk about water use, seismic issues. But what about methane? Anything happening in the methane area for hydraulic fracturing?
Well, there has been discussion, at least, of looking at methane as particularly from exploration production activity as part of the forward cascade on greenhouse gas regulation. My own sense is that at least in the near term, EPA is going to have its hands sufficiently full in dealing with the power plant regulations that it'll be tough to get to that in what remains of this administration. There is focus and attention on whether it's possible to construct fugitive emissions restraints and regulations and that sort of thing for fracking operations. But I think again that's a little bit down the path rather than something that's likely to emerge in the near term.
Jim?
With respect to the methane issue, the states are taking such active roles. Colorado is way out front in this, and they are very actively regulating in this area. And I expect to see much more at the states if the federal government does not act. You mentioned Craig, Colorado. Out in that area, you see that type of activity going on, and the stepping in by the governor, Hickenlooper, to regulate intensively. So, and I think other states will follow suit, many other states.
So I'm about to bring this to the close, but I cannot resist pointing out that we have been joined in the back by my friend Ben Wilson, the managing partner of Beverage and Diamond, who I would not otherwise point out except this is this concept that I explained to Ben of reflected glory, which is to say that Ben's the vice chair of the ELI board. That's not why I'm telling you this. I'm telling you it because his nephew is the quarterback of the Seattle Super Bowl winning team. And all of us have been going around saying, we know Ben Wilson, because he won. Let's have a round of applause for this extraordinary panel. Leading us through the